While WWE is mostly focused on singles wrestling over the years, that shouldn't suggest the tag team division hasn't been important too. Sure, it hasn't always been a focus, but whenever it has, it's been one of the best things in the entire company. But how did it all happen? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now in the entire history of tag team wrestling in WWE. It all goes back to 1953. That was the year Vince McMahon Sr. followed in the footsteps of his boxing promoter father, Jess McMahon, by forming a pro wrestling territory which went by the name of the Capitol Wrestling Corporation. Obviously then, given this territory was in New York, it didn't take long for it to become one of the top ones in the entire country. And that was why, pretty soon, it would gain membership into the National Wrestling Alliance, the governing body of the entire industry. What did this mean in terms of the titles which were defended in the CWC? Well, when it came to tag team wrestling, there would be no territory-specific prize at first. Rather, what duos there would use initially was the NWA Northeast World Tag Team titles, belts which were held by the likes of Don Stevens and Jackie Fargo, or Antonio Rocca and Miguel Perez. That said, come 1958, the time would have arrived for a CWC exclusive prize to be added to the New York promotion, and that was why we would get the NWA Northeast United States Tag Team Championships. How would these new belts fare? Pretty well, as it happened, because some of the better duos in the tri-state area back then would soon be holding them. We're talking about teams like the Golden Grams and the Fabulous Kangaroos here. So when Vince McMahon Sr. seceded from the National Wrestling Alliance in 1963, he'd keep these belts and the lineage they had, with him simply renaming them as the WWF United States Tag Team titles. As you would expect then, they would be the main tag team belts in the WWF throughout the remainder of the 1960s. Hell, with the exception of the often forgotten WWF Intercontinental Tag Team titles, a prize created in honor of the then working relationship between Vince Sr. and New Japan Pro Wrestling, they'd be the only ones formally sanctioned by the territory. Yes, any of the top teams who existed in New York back in the 60s probably got a run with this set of gold. So that meant more championship runs for main event acts like Bruno Sammartino, Gorilla Monsoon, Killer Kowalski, and Gene Kiniski, just to name a few. And we use so many singles acts as examples here because back then, that was really what the division was. Sure, there was still the odd career tag team, but for the most part, things were made up of makeshift pairings, something which was fairly normal back in the territory days, depending on where you were. Yes, during the pre-Vince McMahon Jr. period of the company, tag team wrestling was strong enough that fans were always invested when it hit the ring, and that continued to be the case when the 70s dawned and all new titles were introduced. What was the name of these belts? Well, initially, they'd be known as the WWF World Tag Team Championships. More so than the belts which were being fought over here, though, the important thing about the tag team division in WWF over the decade which followed was the duos that made it up. And there were some very good duos here, duos who were now starting to move away from the makeshift nature of the divisions made up during the 60s. That's right, we were now starting to get pairings which were actually bona fide career tag team acts, pairings such as the Valiant Brothers and the legendary Blackjacks. Yes, there were still some thrown together acts, that was unavoidable, but by now it was starting to feel a little bit more like a division separate from the singles one. And as the late 80s dawned and Vince McMahon Sr.'s era came to an end, this feeling would continue to grow as more teams were introduced and from there went on to have great success. We're talking about the likes of the Moondogs, the Wild Samoans, and the Soul Patrol. Hell, the Wild Samoans would go on to become a major piece of WWE's history in the decades which followed, as the dynasty they began eventually led to the Bloodline being created during the 2020s. And when it came to the Soul Patrol, well, they'd be history-making in a completely different way, as this duo made up of Tony Atlas and Rocky, father of Dwayne Johnson, would be the first pair of African Americans to ever hold the gold. But this wouldn't be the only reason why the Soul Patrol's run as tag team champions was history-making, because aside from the barriers they were able to break down, they were also the team in possession of the gold when Vince McMahon Jr. bought the New York territory from his father in 1982. So because of that, they'd not only be the final WWF World Tag Team Champions, they would be the first ever WWF World Tag Team Champions as well. Hell, they'd remain on top of the division all the way up until April of 1984 as it happened, at which point they were dethroned by the North-South Connection. But while Adrius Adonis and Dick Murdoch would be the first new tag team champions under the Vince McMahon era, they wouldn't be the team to carry that division during the decade. No, by the time the mid-80s got going, they'd be pushed to the side as a golden age of tag team wrestling began, one which took things to a higher level than it had ever been to before. That's right. While people often think of single stars like Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, and the Ultimate Warrior when they think of the Golden Era today, that was far from the only thing firing on all cylinders in the tri-state area here. The British Bulldogs, the Hart Foundation, the Rockers, Strikeforce, the US Express, the Brainbusters, Demolition, the Nasty Boys, the Powers of Pain, the Fabulous Rougeaus. These were just some of the great duos that were doing excellent work here. So good were they all, in fact, it finally felt like WWF had a division which could start to rival what we were getting in the other territories with the likes of the Midnight Express, the Rock and Roll Express, and the Road Warriors. Hell, so strong would the tag team division be during the 80s, at one point there would even be a short-lived women's tag team titles which were held by Joshi legends the Jumping Bomb Angels for a while. And as if that wasn't enough, back over in the men's division, even the top two stars in the company would enter the fray when the Mega Powers were formed. Sure, this pairing of Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage might have lasted for less than a year, and it might have never led to any title success, but the very fact that these two behemoths of the era had entered the division at all only added to its legitimacy as an important aspect of the territory as a whole. Who ultimately benefited the most from this sense of legitimacy? Well, retroactively, it's easy to look back on the Rockers and the Hart Foundation as getting the most out of the situation, because they're the ones which gave us Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart. And when it came to the British Bulldogs, well, the work of the Dynamite Kid here would be game-changing in a way which few others could ever reach, as it was during this run that the Englishman helped to set the template for what wrestling would turn into in the 21st century. That said, if you're going strictly by the numbers, then the most successful of all 80s WWF pairings was Demolition. Why was that? Well, between March 27, 1988 and July 18, 1989, they'd hold the World Tag Team Championships for a total of 478 days, a record which would stand for decades thereafter. So really, for that reason alone, they can't be considered anything less than a giant of the time period. And that's particularly impressive when you consider the fact that this was a team which was widely accepted to have only been created when Vince McMahon was unable to sign the Road Warriors to his company. Of course, the Road Warriors wouldn't stay away forever, though. No, by the time the 90s were dawning, they'd also arrive in WWF too. And with that, the act which many still consider to be the greatest tag team of all time was finally able to hold the WWF tag team titles as well. And as the golden era began to draw to a close, things would continue to remain strong. Why was that? Well, because it was here that more iconic tag teams like Money Inc., the Natural Disasters, and the Steiner Brothers would rise to the forefront. Unfortunately, though, things would hit a snag as the mid-90s came around, because that would be when the New Generation era began, a time which saw WWF as a whole take a massive downturn in business. That's right, while the women's division was dying out, and while the men's singles division was barely being kept afloat by the likes of former tag team mainstays in Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, the duos division in WWF was having difficult times of its own. Sure, there would be plenty of teams here, but few of them were worth much, and too many of them relied on the wrestlers with jobs gimmickry that was so popular with Vince McMahon at this time. Basically, what we're saying here is that for every high energy which gave Owen Hart an early chance to shine, or two dudes with attitudes which saw the Heartbreak Kid and Diesel form their one mid-90s version of the Mega Powers, there were double the amount of overly cartoonish failures. And they weren't helped by the fact that now, as a result of the fallout from the steroid trial, so many of the top duos from the prior era, people like the Legion of Doom, Demolition, and the Nasty Boys, were all gone. What was desperately needed here then was for something to kickstart some life back into the WWF tag team division again. But then to be fair, this was something which was desperately needed for the entire company, especially once WCW really began destroying WWF in terms of both on-screen quality and TV ratings from about 1996 onwards. Thankfully then, this fresh life would come around 1997, as that was the point the New Generation era began to give way to the Attitude Era. And with this, a whole new host of teams would get a chance to rise up to the top. Teams such as the APA, the Hollies, Too Cool, and the New Age Outlaws. And they were about to get into better shape still. Why was that? Well, it would be in 1999 that three teams began to rise to prominence, each of which would play a major role in redefining tag team wrestling for a new era. That's right, we're talking about the Hardy Boys, the Dudley Boys, and Edge and Christian. And the way they were able to redefine the division back then was largely through their groundbreaking series of tables, ladders, and chairs matches, a match type so popular it still appears on many pay-per-views today in 2025. Yes, TLC was such a big hit with fans back in 2000 and 2001, it took tag team wrestling in WWF to heights it had never been before. But then how could these matches, and the teams involved in them, not absolutely blow everyone out of the water here, when what the Hardys, the Dudleys, and Edge and Christian were doing was taking what Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon had done with the ladder match a few years prior and sending it into hyperdrive with a stunt show for the ages. Really, this was something that the main event singles acts couldn't compete with, and that led to more than a little jealousy behind the scenes, as for the first time, there were points where it felt like tag team wrestling was actually the main focus of WWF. Hell, the very fact that 5 out of the 6 men involved in these bouts later went on to become a world champion in their own right should tell you everything you need to know about the importance they had in the grand scheme of things. Would the tag division be able to keep this momentum going as the Attitude Era came to an end and a new Ruthless Aggression era took its place? Yes, at least at first anyway. But the landscape in which it operated would be a very different one now, because after the much maligned Invasion angle saw the WCW World Tag Team titles briefly be defended on WWF TV and, in the process, serve as a taster for what was to come, there would officially be another set of WWE Tag Team Championships introduced. Why was that? Well, in 2002, Vince McMahon decided to create his own competition going forward when he instituted the brand split. Yes, from here on in, Raw and SmackDown would be split into 2 separate rosters, and because of that, each brand would need its own set of belts. As for which show got which, well, in contrast with what happened with the World title, Raw would keep the now renamed World Tag Team titles, the ones with the lineage which went all the way back to the early days of the company, and as for SmackDown, well, they'd get a new prize created for them, one somewhat confusingly known as the WWE Tag Team titles. Sadly though, while this seemed like it would be a good thing for the division at the time, the problems with the whole idea soon became apparent as the brand extension got into full swing. What would those problems be? Well, for one, while the singles division had enough depth in it to support 2 separate rosters back in 2002, the tag team division did not. No, even when it had been at its peak during the heights of the Attitude Era, it was very much built around 3 main teams and a bunch of other supplemental ones. So that was why the Raw division quickly turned into a bit of an afterthought here, as it started revolving around the likes of the Un-Americans, Billy and Chuck, and Lance Cade and Trevor Murdoch. Yeah, there would be some peaks to be found on the Red brand during the early to mid 2000s when it came to duos action, peaks like the excellent Booker T and Goldust pairing, or the underrated La Resistance. But overall, it was another rough period to be a fan of tag action in WWE, or at least it was if you were only watching Raw. And we say that because over on SmackDown at the same time, things were a lot stronger. Sure, it was also true here that many of the prominent teams were thrown together once, but like had been the case back in the 60s, this was not necessarily a bad thing. No, the teams who were thrown together at this time just so happened to be the ones who made up the iconic SmackDown 6, a sextet of performers whose ranks included Kurt Angle, Rey Mysterio, Edge, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, and Chavo Guerrero. Yes, all you had to do during early 2000s SmackDown was take any 4 of these wrestlers in any combination in some sort of tag team situation, and you were pretty much guaranteed to have a banger. Understandably then, many of the early reigns with the new WWE Tag Team Championships would involve this group. Even with how strong things were initially going here, however, over time the same fate would befall the Blue Brand's version of the tag belts as befell the Red Brand's version, with the main reason for this being that, as was the case for most of WWE's history, outside a period during the 80s and the turn of the millennium, Vince McMahon never really put much stock in tag team wrestling. No, as it was always told, the boss preferred to not focus on duos, in part because he felt that if one of the members got injured, it meant he was going to lose 2 acts at the same time. Was this short-sighted? Probably, but that was the line of thinking McMahon allegedly had. And so it was that as the excitement of both TLC and the SmackDown 6 began to die down, and the division got less and less focus, WWE would reach what is generally regarded today to be its absolute nadir in terms of tag team action. What did that mean exactly? Well, it meant the era of thrown together duos filling up the rosters of both shows, something which made each set of belts all but meaningless, as, well, on SmackDown, pairings such as Deuce and Domino or the Basham brothers were holding the gold. Over on Raw, the fort was being held down by the likes of William Regal and Tajiri, or Kane and the Big Show. And when this wasn't happening, the titles would be back to being nothing but mere props for a larger main event feud, as was the case during the lead-up to John Cena and Shawn Michaels' WrestleMania 23 match. Sure, there were brief sparks of light, like when Rated RKO teamed up over on the Red brand, But for the most part, this was the most forgettable era of tag team wrestling there was in WWE. Hell, this would continue to be the case as the 2000s came to an end and the 2010s approached, as more thrown together acts such as CM Punk and Kofi Kingston, Hardcore Holly and Cody Rhodes, Matt Hardy and MVP, and even Roddy Piper and Ric Flair got their reigns with either the WWE or World Tag Team titles. Clearly then, this was doing nothing for the division other than causing it to undergo a slow death. So what was needed here was some kind of creative shakeup which would breathe new life into the whole affair again, something which would finally allow the division to thrive once more and move away from the vast shadow left by the Hardys, the Dudleys, and Edge and Christian. Would this happen? Well, there would be a shakeup of sorts on the horizon, though not one which would necessarily do much to improve the division overall. And that shakeup was the WWE and World Tag Team titles being unified by the Jericho pairing of Chris Jericho and The Big Show. But while that solved the problem of there being two sets of belts for what was effectively one roster's worth of tag teams, it didn't solve the problem of that one roster's worth still being about as weak as it had ever been in WWE. So it was then that over the next half decade or so, with the brand split now effectively being over and us being back to having one set of tag titles again, things would just sort of limp on with acts like the Nexus, Air Boom, the Core, and the Colognes filling out TV time every week in nothing matches which few people had any reason to care about. But then why would they, as it was clear the company didn't care about the division themselves? Thankfully though, after almost a decade of being stuck in a void, there would finally be a lifeline thrown to the tag team roster when, in 2012 and 2013, two new stables were introduced. Yeah, we're talking about The Shield and the Wyatt family, a pair of acts who were able to make tag team wrestling in WWE somewhat worth watching again. Hell, this was particularly true of the Hounds of Justice, as whenever they got involved in a match, it was like watching a pack of wild dogs absolutely swarm and demolish their given foes of the week. And these two acts weren't alone in the division at that point, as it was around here that duos like Team Hell No, The Bar, and the Rhodes Brothers would also rise to prominence. In fact, the Rhodes Brothers would be responsible for the most emotionally cathartic tag team bout in WWE for years, when on September 21st of 2014 at Night of Champions, they beat The Shield to become tag team champions. Obviously then, all of this gave fans of tag team wrestling a sense of excitement, as there was some momentum to speak of once more in WWE, and that momentum would only grow as the two teams who in many ways came to define the era would rise up themselves. Who are we talking about here? Why, the Usos and the New Day, of course, a duo made up of Jimmy and Jey Uso, and a trio made up of Kofi Kingston, Big E, and Xavier Woods who, whenever they were put in the ring together, would create pure magic. Seriously, just look back at any of the bouts these guys had during the mid to late 2010s, and you're pretty much guaranteed to find something worth carving out some time for, especially the great Hell in a Cell match they had in 2017. Hell, this momentum the tag team division in WWE was building again here would only be furthered when the Hardy Boys returned as full-time acts that same year. That said, for as much as improvements were being made, it wouldn't be like this was us going back to the turn of the millennium or anything. No, there was still plenty of material that didn't deserve to be anywhere near a TV as the 2020s approached. Material like the runs of the B Team, the Authors of Pain, and the Good Brothers, or the time Braun Strowman and Nicholas won the belts at WrestleMania 34. Of course, it would only be the Raw belts they'd win here, and the reason for that was because, with the brand split having been reinstituted in 2016, there were now two sets of gold in WWE again, one for the red brand and one for the blue brand. And as far as the blue brand's belts were concerned here, they'd find themselves in the possession of pairings like Heath Slater and Rhino and American Alpha early on. What luck it was that American Alpha were finally on the main roster to kick things into another gear here then, as by that point they'd done just about everything they could to get the division firing on all cylinders down in NXT. That's right, while the tag team roster on Raw and SmackDown were finding mixed degrees of success to say the least during the mid to late 2010s, in Florida, things were very different. Because like it happened on the main roster back at the turn of the millennium, duos action was arguably the best thing on the whole show here. And the reason for that wasn't just because of American Alpha. No, it was also because of the Revival and DIY. So when two of those teams were called up, it only further boosted the tag action taking place on Monday and Friday nights and made it seem, for a little while at least, vital once more. And we say for a little while here because after some time had passed, it was clear neither American Alpha or the Revival were going to be booked anywhere near as well on the main roster as they had been booked down in NXT. No, outside of the Usos and the New Day, the latter of which had by this point broken Demolition's record by lasting 483 days as tag team champions, no one was being booked with any consistency, regardless of how much they delivered in the ring. So when Dax and Cash left WWE in 2020 then, it felt like we might be slipping back into another dark age. At least that was the way it felt as far as the men's division on the main roster was going anyway. Down on NXT though, things were still going strong with the additions of acts like Imperium and the Undisputed Era. And as far as the women were concerned, well, they were now strong enough to have a tag team division of their own again. So it was then that after much fan demand and backstage politicking from Sasha Banks and Bayley, Vince McMahon would introduce women's tag team championships for both the main roster and NXT, with it being the Boss and Hug Connection who were the first holders of the former. Unfortunately though, pretty quickly, both these belts would also be the victim of booking, which made it clear the Boss didn't really care about the division. And that left things in a state where, by the time June of 2023 came around, the NXT versions of the Gold would be deactivated, and the main roster equivalent would be as good as being deactivated, so little value did they have anymore. What was happening with the men's tag team titles as this was going on? Well, they'd be having another revival of sorts, because as part of the overarching Bloodline angle, the Usos would win both the Raw and SmackDown belts to unify them for the first time in almost a decade. As you would expect then, this made the division feel a lot more important again, as with it being such a big part of the biggest angle in the company, it couldn't help but get more TV time. And all this led to the undisputed tag team titles actually being defended in the main event of WrestleMania for the first time ever when, at night 1 of WrestleMania 39 and in April of 2023, Jimmy and Jay would put them on the line against Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn. Yes, for all the ups and downs the division has gone through over the decades, this truly felt like a high watermark in many ways. A high watermark which would be replicated the following year when the Night 1 main event of WrestleMania 40 saw Cody Rhodes team with Seth Rollins to take on Roman Reigns and The Rock in arguably the biggest tag team bout in WWE's history. Sure, since then things might have cooled down again for the division, as each set of belts has bounced around between acts like the Wyatt Six, the Judgment Day, and the Street Profits. But as we've seen, this doesn't mean it can't pick up again very quickly. Now there's every chance that by the time WrestleMania 42 comes around, things will be on the front burner again for duos action. And if that happens, it'll no doubt make for some great TV, just as it's done whenever it's been a focus throughout WWE's long history.